Hi, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, keeping well.
Yeah,
What
that's
have you
good.
been up
That's
to
good.
recently? Anything fun?
No, not really. Just sitting home, quarantine, reading.
Quarantine, yeah, no, same
Yeah,
here, yeah. Good.
that's how life's been. Yeah,
So, on Twitter and stuff, we've been discussing the moral argument, and
yeah.
it sounds like we both have a healthy respect for it, but I think we come to slightly different conclusions. But why don't you're more pro the moral argument, so why don't you kick us off and explain to the viewer what's the moral argument? Are there different versions? How do they fit together? And then I'll respond as and how seems appropriate.
Okay, so as you've said in many of your works, there are four types of moral arguments. I subscribe to one, the grounding moral argument. I would phrase it as the following: premise one, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise two, however, objective moral values and duties do exist. Conclusion three, therefore God exists. So it just grounds the idea or truth value of moral values and duties in God. And because there is truth value to moral values and duties, then there must be a God. Just to elaborate on some of the ideas here, when we say that morality is objective, what we mean is that it is unequivocally true, at least of certain moral statements, that they are true regardless of your own opinion. So it would be fair to say that killing is just, regardless of your opinion, this is a true statement. So it's not subjective, something like ice cream tastes good or chocolate tastes bad. So yeah, I think that's just the general argument. I feel like it's pretty self-explanatory. So I suppose we can just dive into a discussion.
Good, yeah. Maybe just a point of clarification. Does moral objectivism commit you to, in your opinion of it, commit you to a sort of form of absolutism whereby something is always wrong? For example, is killing always wrong? Does moral objectivism imply that moral truths exist like that, or can we have a bit more nuance about it?
Yeah, that's interesting. So there is definitely is, in my opinion, at least, a difference between absolute and objective. Like you said, a moral absolute would be something like killing is always wrong, versus moral objectivism, at least in my view, simply means that the statement is true. But I think to say that truth and universality are equivalent would be incorrect. I don't think absolutism follows, and I think this is for a couple of reasons. I see no contradiction in saying that killing is wrong is a true statement. However, potentially, killing one person, let's say, to save the entire human race is something good. I don't see those contradictory because I'm not saying that killing is always wrong. I'm simply saying that killing is wrong. There are many similar scientific statements which aren't completely absolute. You know, sometimes gravity operates in different degrees in different parts of the universe, and this is true of any objective. From it necessarily follows universality. So I don't see the connection, at least in my view, between moral absolutism and moral objectivism.
No, I'd agree with that. So I mean, yeah. So I personally, the term that gets thrown around quite a lot in British academic circles, and I think in the States too, we talk about pro tanto duties, for example, versus absolute duties. So a pro tanto duty is just a duty that applies all other things being equal. So you know, killing is wrong, all other things being equal, but in self-defense, maybe, then perhaps it becomes permissible. So one can definitely, and I agree with you, be an objectivist without being an absolutist. One could just be a pro tanto objectivist, and we say it's objectively the case that pro tanto killing is wrong. So I'd agree with that. I think that's a really important distinction to make, because I think sometimes people miss that, and then they think of an exception to any moral rule you give them, and then and then they say, oh, then objectivism is true, but that betrays a confusion. I guess another thing to note, of course, is for you to float the moral argument, you don't need any particular moral claim, moral duty to be true. You probably do have a list that you subscribe to, and you may well defend that in other places. But of course, all you need is one moral duty, whatever that so happens to be. And for the sake of the discussion, you can just leave that as a blank. There is at least one moral duty, and God, and that depends upon God. good. Okay, I think that's really clear, and that really helps me to understand kind of your position. I think obviously I'll go for the standard objection, which of course is the Euthyphro dilemma. For the viewer who hasn't heard of it, the Euthyphro dilemma is found in one of Plato's dialogues called the Euthyphro, and it involves a conversation between Socrates and Euthyphro about the nature of justice and goodness, and it goes through various stages, but sort of the climax is Socrates says something to the effect of, is that which is good because the gods desire it or love it, or do they desire it or love it because it's good? And when that's put in a monotheistic context, which I think we both believe in, we would say, is something good because God wills it, orders it, commands it, or does God order it, command it, will it because it is good? And the problem with this is it's a dilemma, and it seems to leave defenders of the moral argument in a pickle. So one option that you can take is you can say, well, God orders us to love our neighbor because it's good. But then that means that God is merely playing an epistemic role. He's observing the goodness of love, and then he's passing that memo down to us and telling us, love your neighbor. But then, of course, goodness is then independent of God, and then your first premise, which is that goodness or objective moral duties can't exist without God, loses some of its force. It's no longer clear why that's the case, because we've separated the two. You still there?
Yeah, sorry.
Oh no, the camera just cut out for a minute. Yeah. So that's one route, but that's unavailable to you. The other option is to say no, it's good simply because God wills it or because God orders it. But the problem is then you end up with what's sometimes called voluntarism, where it becomes arbitrary. God so happened to say, love your neighbor, and so loving your neighbor is good. But God could just as easily have gone, oh, let's go for hate. And then hating your neighbor would be good, and murder would be good. And so it becomes arbitrary.
Doesn't seem to be very correct.
Dependent on God's, what do you say, sorry?
That doesn't seem to be very correct in our common understanding of morality.
Yeah. It becomes arbitrary. I mean, we're lucky, and we live in a world where God flipped a coin and decided love over hate, and that's better. Right. So most people don't want to take that second option. They want to take the first option. Then they take the first option, and then premise one of your argument stops looking so plausible. So that's the Euthyphro dilemma. I don't know if you want to explain it differently, but that's how I would explain it. What would you make of that? How would you understand and respond to that dilemma?
Okay, so I have a couple of just key points. I think I agree with your assessment of the dilemma. I think also it's fair to say this is probably the best, I think, response to the moral argument. Even though one could hold to moral subjectivism, I think this is a better response. As for my response, first I would like to say that first dilemma, first option, even though most people would like to take it, it completely removes the grounding argument, because then morality is no longer grounded in some supernatural entity or God, as we call him, but rather it just seems to be an arbitrary, maybe Platonic existence kind of, and it's not grounded in God, so we can no longer prove the existence of God. I think you're absolutely right on that. However, my response, and actually this is very interesting, I take this from a couple of contemporary philosophers, including William Alston and Philip Quinn. Essentially, it's to say that the dilemma isn't actually a dilemma. And dilemma is when you have two options, right? A and not A. But I would argue that the Euthyphro dilemma isn't actually this way. It's more like it gives you two options, A and B. But there could be an option C, and that's what I advocate for. I think there is a third option. And I think the third option is not to say that God wills the good because it is good, nor is the good good because God wills it, but rather God is the good. So that is to say that God's nature, or what we call good, is actually God's nature. It's something akin or in accordance with God's nature. So for example, we could say that killing is wrong because it directly contradicts God's nature, because it is in direct accordance with God's nature. So when we talk about the good, what we actually mean is that this is similar to or identical with God's nature. God's nature has a certain number of properties, and these properties are what we call the good. So in fact, when we talk about morality, what we're talking about really is God's nature. So this way it removes the dilemma, because it's no longer arbitrary and it's still grounded in God. So of course, this means that God saying something is not the reason that it is good, but rather because God is the good, that this thing is good. I think that would be my response.
Yeah, no, that's a really good response. I've heard that a few days before, and the nice thing about it is it avoids the arbitrariness of the voluntaristic option whilst making morality dependent upon God. And it's not arbitrary, because God, as the theistic belief holds, is a necessary being, and we can discuss that maybe in another video on ontological arguments or something like that. But God isn't held just to be created by chance or to have the properties he has by chance. He necessarily exists, and he necessarily exists in the way that he exists. And so then, of course, his nature is what it is necessary, and therefore morality flowing from that also becomes necessary. It becomes necessarily the case that love is good and hate is bad, for example. The Christian idea that God is love, for example. So you can find scriptural support if you're in that sort of camp. I think that's good. I mean, so I think then the natural standard response to that I'll put forward, and then I might talk about some of my misgivings. But the standard response to that, which you might have heard of, it gets quite high level, but is the sort of open question argument. Have you heard of that?
Oh no, I've heard the response that I've heard is essentially that this basically just only pushes the dilemma one step back. I don't know if that was what you were saying. Oh, okay. So you can iterate that, and then I'll discuss.
Yeah, they're in the same ballpark. So one problem is potentially it pushes the problem back one stage, but I don't find that terribly persuasive, because you've kind of got the necessity of God. There's also what's called the open question argument, and the open question argument was originally used as an argument against utilitarianism by a guy called G. Moore. So what Moore said is, I can understand that something is good or that something is right, and I can understand that something is pleasant, but it's not readily apparent to me that those are necessarily the same thing. If the good equals the pleasant, and once I know something's pleasant, I must automatically know it's good. And yet sometimes I can know that X is pleasant without knowing that X is good. For example, cheating on your wife. It might be pleasant, I can know it's pleasant, but I don't then know it's good. Similarly, for things that are good and pleasant, like reading a good book or sex within marriage, I can know that that's pleasant, but I might still not be surprised to learn, that it's good. And so it looks like the claim good equals pleasure isn't an identity claim. It isn't the same as saying X equals X. Because if I know that something's pleasant, then of course I know that it's pleasant. If it's pleasant, I don't necessarily know that it's good. And if good just is pleasure, then they're just synonyms for each other. So it's like saying unmarried men are bachelors. Well, yeah, they would be. So good and pleasurable can't be synonyms, therefore good must be a separate property. We can apply this to God too. So we can say someone could know that something is in accordance with the nature of God, or mirrors the nature of God, or affects God's nature, however you want to phrase it. I could know that, but I still wouldn't then know that it's good. That would be an additional piece of information. Have you heard of that sort of objection before?
That's interesting. So just to understand, actually, I don't think I have. So just to understand your objection, you're essentially saying that God's nature, we don't necessarily know that it is in accordance with the good, in the same way that we don't necessarily know that pleasure is the same thing as the good. Is that essentially the idea here?
So that's the idea here. So the idea is that in the same way that the hedonistic utilitarian makes an identity claim that pleasure equals good, in the same way that unmarried men are bachelors, their identity claims, you put X equals and then you put Y, their identity claims. And yet, if they were genuine identity claims, they'd be trivially true for people who understood what the terms mean. And Moore's point is, I can know what it means to be pleasurable, and I can have at least a rough grasp of what it means to be good, and yet I don't see that they necessarily line up. And so you can have the same response to theistic approaches. I can know what it means to be in accordance with God's nature, at least in as much as anybody can. I can know what it means to be good, at least in as much as anybody can. You're claiming they're identical, and yet I don't see that. It's still an open question. That's where the name of the argument comes from. Still an open question whether X is, good. I know it's in accordance with God, but it's still an open question as to whether it's good or vice versa. As opposed to a closed question is a question like, he's an unmarried man, is he a bachelor?
It seems that that's the same thing, right? It's like I literally
it's a
saying
closed question rather than an open question.
Okay, I see. That's interesting. Okay. Actually, I like that response a lot. I think my response would be that first, I think we have to make a distinction between the identity claim of the utilitarian versus, I suppose, my identity claim. I think that pleasure is a concept that can be known, like you said. And I think whatever we define as the good, okay, that can be known as well. But I think pleasure is something we experience in daily life. That is to say, it is something we are accustomed with. I don't see that that's the same with God's nature. I think they're kind of distinct in this sense. So I'd argue that pleasure is a concept we understand in our life, in our experience, and so is the good. Equating them then requires some type of proof or argument as to why they're identical. But I don't think it's the same with God's nature. And I think the reason would be my second point, and that is that we have to understand, I suppose, what the grounding argument is trying to get at. I think in its center, the grounding argument of morality is essentially asking, what is the good? And insofar as you don't subscribe to some type of naturalism or non-naturalism of grounding of objective moral duties, then you would say that if all that exists is physical reality, we have no grounding for objective morality. We have no grounding for the good, that is to say. So I think the moral argument really is an exploration of what it is, or what is the good. And the exploration leads you to the conclusion that, okay, we're asking what is the good? And our conclusion is, okay, well, the good can't be anything physical, and it can't operate on a naturalistic or non-naturalistic worldview. So it seems that the only option we have left is to ground it, if it exists, on a theistic worldview. And so then the only option left is to say it's God's nature, and it can't be the other two because of the Euthyphro dilemma. So I'd argue that really, I don't think God's nature is or at least is the same as saying, is the same as a concept like pleasure. I think God's nature is not knowable like that. But I think the entire question is, what is the good? So I think me giving a definition is not really problematic as it is to say that good is pleasure, because we don't understand God's nature like we understand the pleasure. And I think insofar as I'm giving a grounding for morality and it's logically consistent, then I don't really see the problem.
No, I think that's a good response. I mean, so sort of linking into what you said, one of the counter responses to the open question, a sort of simple one that chimes what you're saying is, well, maybe the reason it's an open question when it comes to pleasure and good is because that's not the answer. They're not identical. But maybe when, and this is the crux of the issue, maybe if we really understood what God's nature is, and we really understood what goodness is, and maybe none of us really fully grasp that, we can only approximate it, then we would see that they're identical. And the issue is simply that they're kind of difficult. And so, as you say, when we explore it in detail, we begin to see actually they do begin to line up, and it becomes a closed question gradually through careful analysis. I think that's sort of chiming with what you're saying, isn't it?
Yeah, just to add like a little other small point, I think something interesting as well is that when we talk about, for example, the problem with equating pleasure and good, I think it's very clear, and you give many examples. We can cite examples from our daily experience of how what we call pleasure and what we call good certainly aren't the same, because they achieve different results when we ask questions. But I don't think that's the same with God's nature. I think not only, at least I haven't heard any examples where God's nature is one way, but the good is another. But I'd also add that God's nature, again, differs from the pleasure in our daily life. And I think the argument of the theist is that the good is something completely outside that. It's God's nature. It's something which is outside this physical reality.
I think that's a really good response. I mean, I guess thinking about what a harsher critic than I might say, but I think it goes beyond what we can discuss here. But maybe we could have a discussion about, I suppose, what the atheist might point to would be things like the moral atrocities in the Old Testament, where God ordered, the killing of the Canaanites. Or I don't know whether you're a Christian or not, or a Muslim, but we can give any number of examples, and they could
Sure.
in any of the religions we could point to those. But it seems to me that then you kind of get into a nitty-gritty tit-for-tat about scripture itself, and how do you interpret it, and what was the socio-historical context, what were the Canaanites like. So,
okay, and I think just like, I know that's like a really big topic, but I think maybe just a small response in that regard would be twofold. First, I suppose deism wouldn't, even though I don't subscribe to deism, problem. And I think a bigger problem for the atheist would be that if he's complaining, I suppose, about these supposed atrocities, then at least at minimum, he's conceding the existence of moral realism, objective moral values and duties. And I think just the careful analysis will show you that naturalism can't account for such values and duties. So it has to be something outside of naturalism. And to me, that's enough to affirm theism, although maybe that's too big of a jump for other people. Can naturalism account for these things? I suppose, again, because God's nature is something much or outside of our scope of experience, that we couldn't measure it as critically. But I think the real question is, can naturalism account for these things? And in my opinion, it can. So if these are problematic and naturalism can't account for them, well, that'll lead you places. And I think that's the persuasiveness of the moral argument.
No, that's a really good sort of point in using the Old Testament or the New Testament, or in trying to give any example of something they believe that God ordered, saying that's immoral, then they're assuming an objective moral sense. They've kind of given you one of your premises. That's definitely a good response. That nicely leads on your talk of naturalism. Nicely brings me on to sort of my personal issues with it. Are there any other objections that you'd want to run through, or do you think we've covered the major ones?
Well, I guess the only other objection is moral subjectivism, right? To say that, well, no, the whole thing is wrong because there isn't objective morality. But I suppose that's something we can talk about once we finish this, right? Just to complete this discussion, then we can talk about that.
Okay, yes. So my personal objection to it, I am a Christian and a theist, so I have no. I'm not per se opposed to the moral argument, but I have concerns about the plausibility of successfully demonstrating it in a completely, I don't know, deductive, conclusive manner. And my reasoning for thinking of that is both the premises, it seems to me, at the end of the day, can never be proven beyond all reasonable doubt. So one of them is that there are objective moral values. Well, I think there are, and I think there's an intuitive feel to that. I think that when we look at the past, and we look at people like C.S. Lewis writing about this sort of thing, in his day, you could just take objectivism as a given, and everybody agreed with it. And I remember reading, I think it was either Anscombe. It was either Anscombe, Elizabeth Anscombe, or it might have been Philippa Foot, one of those great female Aristotelians of the 20th century. They discuss subjectivism and they just dismiss it. They go, anybody who genuinely thinks that one can choose one's own morality, and who thinks that rape could ever be good, well, there's something wrong with them, and I'm not going to engage with them. I do think that nowadays that's harder to. We're in a tougher position because more people will subscribe to subjectivism, and I think we should come on to maybe define subjectivism and talk about why more people subscribe to it, and the issues that we have with sort of, well, not issues, how multiculturalism I think often leads to a sense of
that's what I was,
So I think that's one of the issues. One of the issues is although I agree that there is objective morality, I think proving that is really hard. I accept that premise, but I don't see how if somebody's going to dig in their heels, what can be said to them. So I think that premise always is going to have a little question mark next to it. And I also think the first premise, that ultimately we have to ground morality in God, I never really, that's probably where I would have my biggest objection. So when I did my PhD, I studied under two philosophers. One of them was Catholic and a natural law theorist. So he did think that ultimately morality is grounded in God. He did it in a roundabout way through natural law theory, and I agree with him there. So I wouldn't affirm that first premise simplistically. I wouldn't go, it's grounded in God directly. I'd say indirectly. But okay, I personally, I'm prepared from that. But my other supervisor was very open-minded but agnostic. He didn't believe in God. He was a non-naturalist, and so I've read a lot of the non-naturalists, such as D. Moore, who I referred to earlier with the open question argument, W.D. Ross, Sidgwick, all of these sorts of people. And there's this long history of non-naturalism, and then there's a long history of naturalism too, which I find less persuasive than non-natural. I wasn't a Aristotelian supernaturalist, I guess, if you were going to put me in a box, I'd be a non-naturalist. But then there are also a fair number of naturalists, and I think that sometimes when this is used in debate, my concern is that sometimes the apologist is sort of waving away a good 200 years of analytic philosophy, trying to find other ways to ground morality in things other than God. And although they all have their issues, some of them are not insane. And if you want me to give some examples, I can, but some of them strike me as quite plausible, and I would even meet them kind of halfway. It just seems to me and certainly in the context of, for example, the sorts of debates that William Lane Craig does, when he tries to rattle off the argument in 10 minutes, there's no way you can be fair to them in that time, and he's often not. So I remember there was one debate where his opponent held up Kantian deontology and utilitarianism as examples of atheistic ethics, and Craig's response is, well, those are normative ethical theories, not meta-ethical theories. They're not interested in how we ground our ethics. And there's a sense in which he's right, but there's also a sense in which he's being uncharitable. If you read Kant, he actually does do a fair bit of meta-ethics. He does ground it in this idea of reason, rationality, the goodwill, the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. That's actually a piece of meta-ethics. And even Bentham and Mill have a little bit of meta-ethics, not very much. So I'm not sure it's very good. They do have some, and their descendants have worked on it since then. So I sort of feel that in that debate, he was waving it away. And my worry is that a lot of advocates of this argument too quickly dismiss non-naturalism and naturalism.
That's true.
So that's my biggest objection. I don't know if you want me to expand.
I think we'll discuss it. I think this is interesting. I think I agree with you. Non-naturalism is a lot more plausible than naturalism. At least I haven't seen any good reason to ground morality in that naturalistic worldview. I think the biggest proponent, at least contemporarily, would be Sam Harris. Although I think Ian, you talked about this. He kind of commits the problem of, he's not talking really about meta-ethics, but he's kind of talking about how to organize morality, how to give a framework, and his framework is, scientific. It's kind of like a utilitarian scientific approach. Grounding morality, it just tells you how to organize it, and there's a key distinction there. I think you made a very good point about non-naturalism. I think it often is kind of waved away, especially by apologists like Dr. Craig. And I think interesting, I read this in Thomas Nagel's work. He talks a lot about this mental order to reality. And he does affirm the truth of objective morality, objective moral values and duties. But of course, he doesn't ground them in God. He's an atheist. He would say that there's mental order to reality, and that's something that we have to grow to understand. And I think that's where he would ground them. So I would classify him as well as a non-naturalist. I think what's interesting is the discussion between non-naturalism and supernaturalism. Even though obviously I subscribe to supernaturalism, I think there's a good discussion that hasn't happened between the two. What I would say is, I think if we were to think about this argument as, like, I suppose how it dissects between the various worldviews, I think what makes this argument really strong is it kind of, if you would like to say, it throws away naturalism. Put aside moral subjectivism, but assuming you affirm moral objectivism, then it kind of puts to the side naturalism, which I think is a very key step forward. If we put aside non-natural or naturalism, now, okay, we can discuss non-naturalism and supernaturalism. But I think that's what makes the argument really strong. And I think in the context of discussing, philosophy of religion, the existence of God, that's a very big step forward. And I think that's not to be, I guess, thought little of or underrated. But another point I wanted to make was you mentioned moral subjectivism. So I think I'll touch upon this. I have a pretty similar, I guess, argument against moral subjectivism to William Lane Craig. And his argument kind of goes something like this. Essentially, okay,
so
regardless
you want to start by explaining to the viewer what subjectivism is?
Oh, yes. Okay, yeah, I should do that, yes. Okay, so moral subjectivism is essentially, I think, the idea that moral values and duties do not exist objectively, but they're subjective to the person. Every person can have their own moral values and duties. And I think if you extend it out even more, it's to say that morality as a whole doesn't really exist, but it's more of a creation of the human mind. It's dependent upon our emotions and our brains for its existence. It doesn't exist objectively in reality. I think that's a fair definition of moral subjectivism. Would you like to add anything?
No, I think it's pretty good. Yeah. No.
Okay, so I suppose that first of all, okay, I think the reason people will like to gravitate usually towards moral subjectivism is either if you find that the moral argument does affirm the existence of God, and you're kind of skeptical of that, so you're inclined toward moral subjectivism. I think another reason is, like you said, multiculturalism and just the vast variety in moral views, right? Like there are many moral views about a variety of issues. But what I would say here is that, and I think this is a stronger objection, I think it's twofold. First of all, it's to understand that I think universality or agreement has no direct link to objectivity or subjectivity. People can disagree on something and it can still be objective. There are like 7 different theories of how the dinosaurs died. There are at least 12 different theories of quantum mechanics. There are many scientific dilemmas or questions that have been historically disagreed upon, which are contemporarily disagreed upon. Science is subjective. So I think it's important to understand that there's a difference between difference in opinion and interpretation and objective and subjective discipline. I think those two aren't necessarily linked. You can have a lot of disagreement and still be objective.
Yeah, no, I
think that's the first thing.
agree. What I always say to my students is don't confuse the fact that we disagree, that there are different views out there, which is trivially true on morality, with the claim that all those views are equally true. Right. Those are separate claims. This one, that there are many different views out there. Nobody denies that. The question is, are all of them equally good? I suppose you could be an objectivist and you could say they're all equally bad because they're all wrong and here's the right answer, but you get the point.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I think, like you said, the truth value is not directly connected to the amount of disagreement. Yeah, so I don't think agreement is a necessary component or attribute of a discipline in order for it to be objective. But I suppose for the person who simply just, like you said, digs their heels in and just denies outright the objectivity of moral values, I would further this argument. And I think William Lane Craig, he makes this argument. And it goes something like this. Essentially, regardless of what you think of objective morality, I think it's pretty undeniable that at least we all have a moral sense. We all have a moral experience which strongly pushes us to think or act as if there are objective moral values. And a quick look at society gives you this, right? We spend billions of dollars every year at the United Nations protecting human rights. We protest for minorities. We vote. We discuss politics consistently. We always talk about policy. We always talk about what society should do. We teach our children what to do. All of these aspects are almost universal and every human acts on them. So at least in the way we act as if there is objective morality. So I think at least that point is undeniable. So given that we have a moral sense, I think William Lane Craig makes this very clear, there's very good reason to think morality is objective. And essentially that you can't really prove, if you think about it, that anything is objective, right? Even the physical world, well, we could all just be brains in a vat being controlled by scientists, and you don't know that this actually exists. But I'm sure everyone would say that, for example, my phone objectively exists, or that I objectively exist. Similarly, you can't even prove logic or math as objective, because to prove logic or math as objective, you'd have to use logic or math,
Yeah.
right? So it's kind of this assumption. So really, if you think about it, you can't prove anything as objective, but I don't think it follows that nothing is objective. What it means is that you have what Craig calls properly basic beliefs. These properly basic beliefs that the physical world exists, that logic and math are true, that morality is true. These are properly basic beliefs, and you are entitled to think they are true unless the objector gives a reason more powerful than the belief itself. And Louise Antony, she says something to the effect of, any claim for moral skepticism is going to be based on premises less obvious than the truth value of moral objectivism. So it can never be rational to accept moral skepticism. And I really affirm that. I think that's true.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a good response. And I personally, I do find that persuasive. I mean, you can always up your skepticism higher and higher and higher. And you can always up it to avoid any conclusion if you want to. You can throw logic out if you really want to, because you can only prove logic using logic. So ultimately, the only proof that logic is logical is circular. So you can just up and up skepticism, and yeah, you can get out of anything. But I agree, most people, if you talk about hot topic issues and the issues that affect them personally, all of a sudden they're very much objectivists. I'd agree with that. I mean, I won't bring up any examples here, but we can think of the sorts of, if you think about, I don't know, immoral sexual acts, certain sorts of, people will get properly passionate about that, and so they should. That shows that on some level they feel it's an objective moral truth, I think. No, so I do respect that, and I do have a degree of sympathy with that. I guess maybe the disagreement is about, it may be about the circles we move in, about how persuasive it is as an argument when trying to persuade somebody. So, I mean, a lot of my friends, I used to live in London, very, very multicultural. So they were very committed to that worldview. A lot of them had a very sort of Eastern, a lot of them were from the East, from China and places like that. Often in China, they're much more, it runs through Eastern philosophy. They're more comfortable with subjectivism. Not completely, but to a greater extent. They're often more skeptical in Asian thought of the idea of objective truth, or that we can access objective truth. So for them, trying to get any traction on that premise was really tough. But it may well be that with a different sort of audience, it gets a lot more traction. At least that's my anecdotal evidence.
Yeah.
If you look at Buddhism, for example, Buddhists are very skeptical of this idea that we can know anything about ultimate reality. They're all about down here, and if you interpret it in different ways, they're quite comfortable with that. So they embrace more than one truth that's mutually exclusive. The Western ear, that's kind of weird, but that's the background that they grow up in.
That's true. That's true. Also, I wanted to add something. When it comes to, you said about people accepting it, I think this is a very good point. I think when you look at like overall, right, philosophy of religion, arguments for the existence of God, I think it's very true to say that perhaps cosmological, maybe even fine-tuning arguments are perhaps more intellectually persuasive, or at least easier to prove in some sense. They rely mostly on logic and science, if you will. But the moral argument is a little more abstract in that sense. And when it comes to something like that, there's always going to be room for disagreement. And it's, like you said, harder to ground. It's not something mathematical and calculable or quantifiable. But I think an interesting point is that overall, perhaps maybe it's not as provable, but it's more persuasive. And I mean that there are many people who haven't heard of the argument who will strongly affirm moral realism and moral objectivism, even if they don't believe in God, because, like you said, it's something very core to at least most human beings. So I think, and at least personally to me, when I first heard the moral argument, it stunned me, because as a small child, of course, you're always going to affirm moral realism. It seemed absolutely true that killing is wrong. So to many people who haven't encountered the argument, it's very persuasive, because you can always deny, for example, the fine-tuning of the universe, or the necessity of a beginning, or something like this, something intellectual like that. But something more central to your human experience isn't as easy to deny. So I think perhaps it's not as provable, but it's more persuasive to at least a group of people.
Yeah, no, yeah. Maybe, yeah, I mean, I definitely, yeah, maybe to a group, to certain people who have that belief so very deeply inside them. I do remember there was one guy I was discussing it with. He was sort of agnostic-y atheist, and he hadn't done any philosophy of religion or anything like that. And I was talking about, what I did and the sorts of arguments that I did. And I sort of mentioned the moral argument. I wasn't even defending it, I just mentioned it. And he got really quite persuaded by it and quite interested in it. And it slightly surprised me because I wasn't even putting it forward as an argument, but he found that really intuitive. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, no, I think that's a good point of agreement there. I think,
that's interesting.
in my experience, I guess it depends on who you're talking to.
Yeah. I think ultimately, when it comes to philosophy and talking about theism and whatnot, you need to approach it from different angles, because some people will be more persuaded by intellectual and logical kind of deductive proofs, but some maybe not. Some can deny it, but aren't as easily able to deny the truth of morality. So, and I think it requires that diversity in argumentation. So yeah.
It would be interesting. I mean, I wouldn't know enough about it. It would be interesting to see a group of academics or apologists or whatever would get together and think about different apologetic strategies that you should use with different groups of people.
Interesting.
Because I think one of the assumptions that we can make is that everybody thinks in the same way, and of course they don't. And so, just off the top of my head, for example, when you're discussing Christianity, for example, with Hindus, they're very happy to have as many gods as they want. They're polytheistic, right? And they'll often see the different gods as different aspects of the divine. So from their perspective, if you believe in Jesus and they believe in whichever god that they worship, they just don't see an issue. They're like, that's fine, you do that, I'll do this, and you're kind of like, I'm telling you about Jesus, I want to come to church. They're like, it's all the same deep down. And you can sort of end up slightly scratching your head. But I suspect that for them, maybe a strategy that might work would be talking about some of the spiritual and psychological benefits, because they agree there's a transcendent ultimate reality. What they disagree is how best to approach it. For them, there's more than one way. We're saying there's one way. So maybe we don't need to discuss the existence of God. They accept that. What we need to do is drive at them from a particular approach. Anyway, I'm sort of rambling. But it would be interesting to see all and then Buddhism is a different kettle of fish again, because they're much more skeptical about what we can know about ultimate reality. So that they talk about ultimate truth and conventional truth. So you could have a different book of apologetics on each one, and no doubt they would probably have their own book of apologetics on how to convert us over to their position. Fair enough. That might be a fun project one day. Anyway, that's just me.
That's interesting.
That's me rambling.
Yeah.
Good.
I've also noticed there's just kind of to echo your point. Also, like scientists, for example, when they look at like apologetics, because they're not, I suppose, as if you would like accepting a philosophy. Like I've heard many scientists who subscribe to scientism, right? The idea that you can only know anything through science, which in my opinion is terrible epistemology, but not in theirs, right? So maybe with them, you have to approach them with arguments which are purely like, which work within the scientific methods, for example, fine tuning. So I think you're right. Even it comes down to occupation, even what you work in, what you're accustomed with, what you're accustomed to work with, that all plays a role in what kind of strategies work best towards persuading you to truth. So I think that's very interesting, actually.
Yeah. Not even as simple as Western, Eastern, Hindu, Buddhist. It's also scientifically minded versus historically minded versus creative. I mean, I remember one of my fellow PhD students, he was sort of always quite uncomfortable talking about religion, but he was a massive music lover and a very talented musician. And one day he sort of casually remarked to me, if he was ever going to be converted, it would be through music. And that's not how I would approach the issue. I'm like, how does music prove the existence of God? But for him, it was almost something divine about music. And he was kind of open to the possibility that the music might cause him to have a divine. And I was just quite stunned by that from a
I've heard I've heard arguments. I haven't read into them, so I'm not going to claim I know them. But I've heard arguments that argue from like aesthetics to God, and I'm not familiar with them. But maybe those kinds of arguments would work with those kinds of people, right? Those appeal to them more. So yeah, that's actually really, I never even thought about that. That's really interesting.
Well, maybe we'll have to do another conversation about aesthetic argument.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you want to add more about this kind of discussion of the grounding moral argument? Did you want to move on to the others, or?
Yeah, shall we have a little look at some of those? I don't think either of us were so persuaded by them, but let's go through them a little bit so that the viewer can at least be aware they're out there. Do you want to lead on the next one?
Sure. I guess I'll start with the epistemological argument, because that's the one you laid out after the grounding argument. So this one goes something like, at least when I read it, it was premise one: if we are to know about morality or duties, God must exist. Or objective moral values and duties, God must exist. Premise two: we know about objective moral values and duties, therefore it follows logically that God exists. Which is interesting, but at least in my opinion, and I think you agree here, I find this kind of weak. I see no reason to accept premise one, the idea that if we are to know about objective moral values and duties, God must exist. Because I could argue that a naturalist could easily say that we obtained all our cognitive abilities via some type of socio-biological evolution, and that's why we think what we think. But that says nothing about the actual ontological status of these moral values and duties. I think arguing from epistemology is a little weaker. I think it's much stronger to argue ontologically, just where you ground these things, as opposed to how you know them, because there's lots of argument about how we know anything at all.
Mm. Yeah, and I also worry that a lot of the time it's going to end up piggybacking off the grounding moral argument. Because it may be that the reason we can't learn about it without God helping us is because it's a supernatural property and we're physical natural beings. And so the only way we can access that is with supernatural aid. So I worry that the reason you might subscribe to that first premise is because you already believe in the grounding moral argument.
That's right.
That sort of occurs to me. And again, sort of the problem is, it seems to me that the naturalist and the non-naturalist are going to have stories for how you can, if it's a natural property, then it makes sense that we would learn about it the same way we learn about any natural property, all sorts of issues with that. So it seems to me that, again, the reason you'd affirm premise one would be because you're a supernaturalist, which means you're already affirming the grounding moral argument.
Yeah.
An interesting note, if you're interested in non-naturalism and supernaturalism, this is a major problem for the non-naturalist. One of the major issues that non-naturalist has, standard objection to non-naturalism, is how we can come to learn about these properties. So I don't think we can go into that now, because I can only remember so much off the top of my head. But the viewer or you are interested, have a little Google for that sort of topic, and that's a very good objection to non-naturalism.
Yeah. That also, I would argue that, I suppose, if you're grounding it non-naturally, I know this is probably not the best argument, but it just kind of popped in my head now. If you're grounding the truth of objective moral values and duties non-naturally, if it's not within a person, right, or some kind of being or entity, to me that seems kind of wrong, right? Like, because usually when atheists talk about the problem of evil, it seems like, why isn't God doing more? Why isn't he interacting more? It seems to me there's something wrong with the picture of having just these abstract, platonic moral values existing non-naturally, but they aren't embodied somehow. To me, at least, I know it's probably not as logical of an objection, but there seems to be some kind of misnomer there between why isn't anyone doing anything and how do we come to know them. At least that's something else I kind of noticed.
Yeah. No, I'd agree with that. Yeah, some interesting stuff there. I'd have to go and think about it. Good.
I don't know. Also, my problem is also that, like, unless you subscribe to, like, to me at least, where do these moral values begin for the non-naturalist? Like, do they, and I suppose it varies from each person's perspective, but does one point they begin to exist? Have they just always existed, but they're non-temporal? I don't know. I'd have to dig deep into it. I really honestly haven't looked into non-naturalism that much.
So one of the sorts of stories they might give, and as you say, there's more than one. One of the stories they might give, which I do find quite persuasive, is they'll ground it in reasons. And so, a reason to do something. And they'll take reasons as kind of just basic building blocks of the universe. You've got your physical properties, you've got your mental properties, however you want to divide up the world ontologically, and you've got reasons. And so, a very simple example, why shouldn't you put your hand in fire? It will burn your hand, it will damage your hand. It gives you reason not to do it. So the fact it hurts you gives you reason not to do it. Okay, and so why shouldn't I push you in the fire? Because it will hurt you. That gives me reason not to do it. And then you can kind of build these reasons on top of each other. You have lots of different reasons which relate to how we interact and so on and so forth. And from that, you can eventually get a series of norms, such as pro tanto, at least, don't kill. And it all just, so it's all built on the reasons, which are just basic building blocks of the universe. And they kind of build it like there. So if you read Scanlon and stuff, T.M. Scanlon, you'll find What We Owe to Each Other. I for the viewer, I'll go and get it. Hold on.
Okay.
There it is. Sorry about that. There you go. What We Owe to Each Other.
I wrote it down. Okay.
You might have seen it in. Have you ever watched The Good Place?
The Good Place?
The Good Place, yeah, it's a TV program on Netflix. It's about some people who die and they go to heaven, but all is not as it seems, and they're not sure they should be there. And it's about 3 or 4. So it's a comedy, but it's got a lot of philosophical ideas in it. So one of the people is a philosophy ethics professor.
Oh, wow.
So he, along the journey, ends up trying to teach them about ethics, and he talks about Scanlon quite a lot. So you'll see they've got that exact book in the series. So I was watching it with my wife, and in a very nerdy way, I was like, I've got that book. I would recommend that. It's what we owe to each other. If you watch my video on Buddhism, the Wisdom of the East series, I include a link to a little extract where they discuss Buddhist conceptions of the afterlife. It's a really good series, and it discusses a lot of philosophy. But the point, getting back on topic, he grounds all of his moral theory in the idea of a reason. And so reasons just exist as part of the fabric of the universe. Where the universe came from, he doesn't have to answer that. He doesn't have to answer big metaphysical questions. The only claim he has to make is there are these things called reasons. And then when you correctly analyze reasons and respond to them appropriately, you get a moral theory coming out of that. So that's one of the stories that they tell. And I do find that quite persuasive, although what I personally would do is, as a natural law theorist, and if you want to read my thesis, which you can find on my website, I argue that we should interpret reasons as ends understood in the Aristotelian sense, and then understand ends come from form, which come from God. And so then ultimately reasons are grounded in God,
right,
in a kind of roundabout way. And I tie reasons into ends and forms and that sort of thing. So I kind of try and have both Scanlon and natural law theory and God all in. Whether I'm successful, you'll have to read it and judge for yourself.
I think that yeah, that is interesting. I would just like to say I think it's fair to say that one can agree to the self-evidence of these supposed reasons and these truths to arrive at moral norms, but perhaps that's just not, and there's not sufficient grounds to just ground them by themselves. You do require some type of Aristotelian form, or ultimately God, to ground them.
Yeah, okay. No, I think that could be.
Well, I suppose I'll have to read your thesis and see what you argue.
Yeah, and I guess it depends a little bit on some of your background metaphysical assumptions. So
Yeah,
if you have quite a robust background metaphysics, then you're going to want to ground your reasons in a robust background metaphysics. But if you're happy with something fairly light touch, you may be happy just to have reasons and the explanation just that I gave you. That might be enough for some people. But you might think actually, they need to be grounded in something more. So that's why I grounded them in ends ultimately.
interesting.
If you want to read that, do, and if you want to have another conversation about it at some stage.
Yeah, that sounds interesting.
Good. So that's the epistemological argument. I mean, we got slightly off topic there, but that's part of the fun. There's two other versions, at least that I've identified. Do you want to discuss? Do you want to lead on the next one?
The motivational argument. Maybe you can discuss that one. I personally did not find that persuasive at all. I found it very, very weak. But I don't know. What are your thoughts on it?
So, I mean, I haven't seen it be discussed very much by respectable academic theologians and Christian theistic philosophers. But the argument is along the lines of, if we are to be motivated to behave morally, there must be a God. We can be motivated to behave morally, therefore there must be a God.
Interesting.
I've only seen that mostly you see it on like discussion boards online, and sometimes if you get certain sorts of pastors from who aren't necessarily hugely well educated thumping their Bibles, sometimes you get those sorts of people putting forward.
Yeah, if I was an actress, I would easily object that. At least to me, it seems very plausible that you could be motivated to do anything morally simply for sociobiological evolutionary reasons. I don't see a reason that you need some entity for this.
The other place you do see them is you see particularly the new atheists putting forward this argument as a parody of other versions of the moral argument.
A straw man, sort of.
As a straw man, yes. So I do remember one debate with Christopher Hitchens. It might have been the one where he debated William Lane Craig. And Craig put forward the grounding moral argument, and Christopher Hitchens responded by saying, how I can obviously do good things. I can obviously be a good person and give to charity. And that just kind of misses the point. He was sort of taking a really weird claim about, Craig was making a claim about the grounding of morality, and he was just saying, I'm still a good person. Nobody's denying that. I will say this, that the only possible argument that you might put forward in defense of the motivational argument, but it presupposes a Christian worldview, is if you believed in the fall, then you might think that we're intrinsically corrupted in some way and thus incapable of behaving morally unless we get the help of the Holy Spirit. I put this forward to one of my students, to my class. I was explaining it, and one of them said, well, if you believe in the fall and in original sin, then maybe you could hold it. And okay, that's an interesting point. The problem is, of course, it presupposes the Christian worldview, which is what you're trying to. If you're a presuppositionalist and about apologetics, maybe you could float it. But I didn't find it pleasant.
Yeah, I would say also, like, perhaps maybe that just becomes a truth that you believe in, but it's not an argument, right? It's not something you can utilize as a truth to get to some other truth. It would just be something you believe in, right? Like you said, it's presupposed, kind of.
Yeah, because it would end up being circular.
Yeah. Okay. On the last one, Kant's moral argument. I actually, when I read this, I have not heard of this one before. I'm familiar with, of course, Kant's categorical imperative and his moral view. I have not heard of this moral argument. So I was very interested by it. So, I mean, I guess I'll run it down. It's 5 premises. It goes like this. We ought to achieve the summum bonum, basically the idea that we will have perfect virtue and happiness. Premise 2, ought implies can. So therefore, it follows logically. Premise 3, we can achieve the summum bonum. Premise 4, God is necessary to achieve the summum bonum. And therefore, of course, it follows logically that the conclusion, premise 5, God exists.
Not a bad argument, is it? I remember when
it's actually very interesting.
Yeah, I remember I only came across it about 2 years ago when I started teaching a course on philosophy of religion. And I was looking at moral arguments, and I came across that one. And at first I was quite like blown away and thought, oh wow, that might genuinely be a good argument. I do think there's an issue, but what did you think of it? You go
Interesting.
first.
So at first, my first thought was like, okay, well, I don't see any direct problem, at least with each premise individually. But what I kind of noticed at first was I find it very similar to the grounding argument, because ultimately you're kind of grounding, if you will, the idea that the summum bonum itself is something good, something that we ought to achieve. It's kind of taken as a given. And I suppose from there he moves to God. And I suppose the real question comes in the first premise, whether you think that is even something you ought to achieve. But I suppose another kind of reason I would prefer the grounding argument is, first, one could deny the first premise of the argument and still maintain the existence of objective morality, right? You could say that I don't necessarily think we ought to achieve the summum bonum, but I still think there are moral virtues, and it is I still subscribe to moral realism. You could easily make that argument, I think. And I think the second is that it's not as powerful as an argument, the Kant's moral argument, as the grounding argument, because it doesn't outrightly I guess, discuss the inability of naturalism to account for these types of things. Because I ultimately think it's a weaker version of the grounding argument. At least that's how I see it. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I also sort of honed in on that first premise. It seemed to me, if you change it from, we ought to achieve the summum bonum to we ought to strive to achieve the summum bonum, then the rest of the argument kind of falls away, because we can strive for it even without God's help. We'll just never get there. Right. So it seems to me that first premise was sort of, at first it looks very plausible. We ought to achieve the summum bonum, the sort of perfect good. Yeah, we ought to have the best world. Is it that we ought to have the best world, or that we ought to try to have the best world? And if you change it to try to have the best world, the rest of the argument fails. So that for me was ultimately why I don't think it works. Although I did get excited for about like 2 hours when I first came across that, thinking, oh, this is really a good argument. And then I ultimately I don't find it persuasive.
Yeah. I think I think it's like you said, ultimately the idea of perfect virtue and happiness, even if you take it to be something good, I don't see necessarily that it follows that we ought to do it. Like you said, it's something we ought to strive for. But it really is interesting. I haven't seen this before. I suppose another thing I wanted to talk, actually, I'll mention something first, then I'll ask you about some of the research that you've done. But I wanted to talk about, you said, I think lots of times apologists, and I think this is very true, they kind of dismiss Kantian deontology or utilitarian or these other types of frameworks that don't rely on theory or just the existence of God. What do you think about this? I think ultimately, and I think you mentioned this, it kind of misses the question that the theist is kind of posing, right? And I to simplify, when I talk to people who aren't even familiar with the subject matter, I think a very simple way of discussing it is this example, right? If I were to tell you that every chocolate bar which was more than 6 inches tasted good, and every chocolate bar which was less than 6 inches tasted bad, well, I've just given you a very easy way to quantify and organize every chocolate bar as either good or bad, tasting good or bad. But that says nothing about whether or not taste is objective. I could argue that you can organize anything under any framework, and you'd perfectly be able to put anything, subjective or objective, in various groups. So I think simply posing a framework saying, okay, well, look, I can organize all these moral values as good or bad without using God. The question is really about, but why is it good in the first place?
Mm. Oh, I see. And then you're asking about that in the context of thinkers like Kant. Yeah. Because I can see that if you read Sam Harris's, and I haven't read the full book, so I may be being unfair to him, but I haven't read the all of it, the moral landscape, but I've read some little extracts. Yeah. A lot of the time people accuse him of doing something a bit, obviously you're sort of parodying it, but something a little bit like that on close analysis. He just defines good as X and then works from there. And of course, if you do that, you can define anything into existence however you want it.
Yeah.
I would say that with Kant, he's probably would probably sit in the non-naturalist camp nowadays, and he would probably have sympathy with people like Scanlon. So Scanlon traces some of his thought back to Kant. And although Kant doesn't ground it in reasons in the way that I gave it to, he grounds it in rationality, which he thinks is a sort of human faculty that we all share universally and objectively. He grounds it in that, and he argues that it's sort of self-evident that a good will, i.e. a will that's working in accordance with rationality, is good. He argues it's good by definition. So it's a bit more sophisticated. It starts from reasons, it starts from rationality. So I suspect the place where it would fall down for you would be about, well, what are reasons? What is rationality? And I do think that's an issue. What is rationality? It seems to me that Kant kind of starts from rationality and goes from there. Scanlon starts from reasons to rationality and then goes from there. And it does seem, I can't make sense of rationality without the idea of a reason as the foundation. But I think for Kant, he would hold that you've sort of reached metaphysical ontological bedrock when you arrive at concepts like rationality. There's no further analysis to go. You have to stop somewhere. So it may be that that's just where you go and you build from there. So I think that would probably be how he would respond.
Right.
Does that answer your question to some extent? I'm not saying I'm not Kantian. So
right.
One, I don't find it persuasive, and two, I may not be the best defender of it, but that's off the top of my head how I think he might go about it.
Yeah, actually, I had this kind of thought, like you said, like what is reason, what is rationality? There was a debate between Sam Harris and William Lane Craig about whether or not atheism can account for objective moral values. And even realistic route, I suppose, which I find less convincing. I thought it did occur to me. At one point, Sam Harris was asked a question by a member in the audience, and his response was something to the effect of, well, ultimately you can question anything. You can question why we have the reasons we have, why we have the logic, why we even think. You can doubt all of it, but ultimately the book has to stop somewhere. He sees no reason for the book to stop at God. Why can't it just stop with our basic reason? Thinking about this, and I understand there are many conceptualist arguments as well. And I was kind of pairing the two. And conceptualist arguments essentially argue that atheism can't even account for logic and these kinds of like numbers in mathematics. And I was kind of thinking, well, if you really think about it, one could advance the argument that ultimately, not only do you need a grounding for morality, but to even ground logic as objectively true, you would need God. And I suppose that is a very, very strong kind of statement. But I was thinking, well, ultimately, if you're going to talk about these non-naturalist theories, argue that even reckoning ultimately in God or something to that effect. But I don't know, I haven't thought about it too much, but what are your thoughts?
Wait, can you say that last sentence again? You broke up a little bit.
Oh, essentially to ground even reasoning or logic, you need some kind of God or some kind of something non-natural to ground it in ultimately.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I've heard these sorts of arguments described as transcendental arguments for the existence of God. That sort of what you're thinking of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I was thinking like, for example, planting. He talks about how to know if any of the senses that you have are true, right? If you don't know if any of the thoughts that you have are true, because they're simply the product of evolution.
Oh, okay.
It's possible that you're thinking, you can't affirm truth. What you think is true is simply what is advantageous for you. So perhaps to even ground reason and rationality, which is the groundwork for perhaps Kant and maybe Scanlon, even those things that they're using to ground morality are ultimately grounded in something non-natural.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. Oh, yes. Okay. Yes. Sort of evolutionary arguments. Yes. And let me give me a few seconds just to think about them?
I haven't thought about it too much, but it's just something that's kind of been on my mind lately. I don't know. I thought I'd share with you.
Yeah. I mean, so Plantinga's argument for the viewer is that if evolutionary naturalism is true, so he's not, evolution's a separate issue, but if we have evolved from blind evolutionary forces without any supernatural interference, it's just nature. Theistic evolution, you're in the clear. But evolutionary naturalism, then all of your mental faculties have been developed purely for their survival and reproductive value, not for their ability to seek truth. In the same way that lions developed sharp teeth because the lions that had sharp teeth were able to hunt prey, and then they passed on those sharp teeth to their cubs, and then it carried on. Our mental faculties are only there because they allow us to survive, not because they allow us to arrive at truth. And so we have no reason to be confident in their truth-seeking ability. And I do think that's a good argument. My only thought off the top of my head is it doesn't seem to me to be a major stretch to say that, at least when it comes to everyday sorts of affairs, so when you think about ultimate reality and quantum physics and all bets are off, but when you're thinking about the sorts of truth that we need, the sorts of survival and facts on the mid-level, surviving in sub-Saharan Africa, truth and survival factors will kind of often line up. So, for example, your mental faculties will need to tell you whether or not there is a predator nearby or prey nearby. But that's both advantageous from a survival perspective, and it's also truth-seeking. When it comes to those sort of everyday appearances, there's going to be a nice lining up of our survival element of our mental faculties and the truth-seeking element of our mental faculties. And so it seems to me that at that level it's relatively weak. I think he would be right in saying when we then think about ultimate reality, our mental faculties, there's no reasons to assume that they'd be up to the task, because they've not evolved to do that. They've evolved to help us survive, not to guess the mind of God. But I think we could probably accept that. I mean, a lot of the time when we try and think about these things, eventually our mental faculties do break down. We can't really grasp them. We can't really grasp quantum physics. We can't really grasp the age of the universe and multiverse theory. We can kind of get there a little bit, and we can describe bits of it using maths, but ultimately it's beyond us. Likewise with God, we can talk about him if he exists or whatever, but ultimately, maybe our mental faculties do break down. But it seems to me the atheists could respond by minimizing their discussion, just talking about those mid-level, what are sometimes called dry, medium-sized objects, the everyday sorts of things that we interact with, and say they're good enough for that. And that doesn't strike me as a crazy claim that truth and survival instinct will add up. Because if there isn't a lion there, or if there is a lion there and your mental faculties tell you there isn't, it's false and you're dead. And so those are the thoughts off the top of my head.
Okay, maybe this is a little off topic, but this is an argument that I hold in very strong regard. I think it's very, very powerful. And it was inspired actually by Sam Harris, because he argues, when he talks about free will, he says that, okay, well, under naturalism, if we take naturalism to be true, then we don't have free will. And I think that's very true. So if it's true and I would say this is related to truth. If it's true that under naturalism, we have no free will, everything is determined, then I'd argue the problem is that it creates a logical fallacy. Namely, if naturalism means we have no free will, if we have no free will, we don't know if any thought we think is true, because we're mandated to think everything we think. There's no reason to think anything we think is true. It's simply mandated, and any response you give, well, that's mandated as well. So it seems that if we have no free will, then we have no basis for truth. And I personally think this is a much stronger argument. But then the problem, of course, is that if we don't know that anything is true, well, you don't know that naturalism is true. And that was the very premise that you started with. So it kind of self-contradicts itself. So perhaps this could be a better way of achieving the idea that, maybe truth ultimately can't be grounded in some worldview like that.
No, I think that's a fruitful line, I think. So that's Kant's got an argument that's very similar to that. Kant talks about, I'm worried I get this mixed up because he used lots of fancy terms. Talked about the noemological and the phenomenological.
Yeah.
But the point about it is, when you examine the physical world, it looks like everything's deterministic. One ball bounces into another and it's all describable. For him, with Newtonian physics, we would just change that to Einstein, and the principle would be the same.
Right.
And so then, given that we're part of the physical world, it looks like we're determined. So that's one side. But then he also says, on the other hand, we like to, we seek truth with our mental faculties. We reason. We do all of these things that sort of transcend the physical. And if those are to be true, then we're going to need to have free will. We're going to need to presuppose free will. Otherwise, as you say, all of our decisions are just determined by physical this, that, and the other. Therefore, on a phenomenological level, we need to assume that there's more to us than just the physical, and that's some element to us which isn't deterministic and is grounded in reasons and ultimate reality and yada yada yada. So therefore, he thinks there's sort of two elements to human beings that sandwiched on top of each other, and he doesn't weigh in on how they precisely fit together, but he thinks we must have free will, otherwise nothing that we say we have any reason to think it's true. And I do find that quite persuasive. I haven't researched that idea particularly and looked at modern critics of it, but it does strike me as pretty persuasive. As you say, if we live in a deterministic universe and there is no free will, then every opinion you have is down to chance, down to, well, maybe not down to chance, but down to the fact that you were determined to believe that. And then there's no reason to think it's true. So there's got to be free will. And if you think that free will is non-physical or requires something non-physical or something that transcends the physical, however you want to conceptualize, and then you're opening a big can of worms with a free will debate and philosophy of mind and all sorts. But yeah, if you think, I think free will is a really fruitful avenue. And I think you need to presuppose free will to at least some extent in order to have any form of rational debate. Yeah. That's a good point of agreement, I think. I actually need to disappear in a bit. So shall we?
It was a great discussion. Honestly, it went a little off track, but it was great. It was a lot of fun. I really, really enjoyed it. Hopefully we can have another one.
Well, hopefully the viewer will like that. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll say goodbye to the viewer and I'll stop recording and then we can chat. How does that sound? And then we'll wrap up. All right. Bye, viewer. Hope you enjoyed it. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and do check out the Conscious Philosopher's channel for excellent videos on philosophy of religion. Until next time, goodbye.